Okay, thanks everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Yeah, is it nodding? Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Raimondas for the introduction and to Bergen Global for inviting me here. I'm impressed at this Global Issues series that gets people into a nice university atmosphere so early in the morning. So as Raimondas already said, I'm from the European Commission's DG Climate Action. I'll try not to speak for too long so that we can have a bit of discussion. And I work on mainly two things. So one is the interface between climate science and policy, and the other one is the international negotiations. So I thought for this talk it would be mainly on the science policy interface side. But we'll see how it goes. So so what I'm aiming to talk about today is to demonstrate how climate policies are grounded in science. I thought about this because you probably hear terms like we have to get to zero emissions or climate neutrality or 40% by 2050, 50% by 2050, thrown around a lot. And I assure you, these numbers are not plucked out of thin air. They are based on science, and that's what I thought it was a good idea to talk about. So this diagram here is just something I invented yesterday. It's not from a very fine peer-reviewed academic study or anything, but it was just my attempt at looking at demonstrating a framework for climate policy. So we start with science. The science informs the targets that you set. The targets that you set inform the action that you take. And on top of that, a civil society action is also important in various directions because no fight against climate change will be won or lost in government ministries and science labs on its own. So that's what I'll talk about. So we'll start off with the science. So listen to the scientists. And if you want to know what's going on in climate science, the Ipcc, the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is always the best place to start. It celebrated its 30th birthday a few years ago, so I think it's now maybe 32. This is the official line. The IPCC reports are the most authoritative assessment on the science of climate change, and it's true as policymakers. That's what we use, and it's not. It's partly because the reports are heavily reviewed by both scientists and governments. They come out every 5 to 7 years. The findings are heavily debated. They have a responsibility to demonstrate findings based on what says here, the weight of evidence and the level of agreement. So it's basically the final word on climate science. So when you meet someone who says, but they missed this and they missed that, and what about this new phenomenon I've seen? If these new emerging facts are any good, then they'll be picked up in the next one, even if they're not in the previous report, which is and they're also very carefully. The statements are very carefully calibrated in terms of the level of certainty. So it's very important for policymakers making decisions that they can base their findings on this kind of science, not just attempting their own literature reviews or listening to other people that have listened to scientists. So I'm going to demonstrate this with science note user number 1, which is Greta. I'm sure you all know Greta Thunberg, and this is a speech she gave to a committee of the European Parliament last year, and she said, I'll start reading now, so around the year 2030, 10 years, 259 days and 10 hours away from now, we'll be in a position to set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control that will most likely lead to the end of civilization as we know it. That is, unless in that time, permanent and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society have taken place. So this is not an entirely scientific statement, but it's also not without use of the science, which you can see if we dig a bit deeper. So 10 years left to save the world. Where did she get that from? I don't know. I wasn't writing the speech. But if you look at the IPCC's latest report, now it's their third latest report, but the one from 2018, you do get this finding which says that so global warming has already reached 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. This is the finding of the report. So that's here, and it's at the current warming rate. It's projected to reach 1.5 between 2030 and 2052. So a little over 10 years away. So I think that's what she's getting at when she says 10 years left. So 10 years before we're in the cloud, but only at the start then of the cloud where a 1.5 degree temperature threshold will be reached. This is another chart from the same report. This is just, if you like, the case for optimism. It's basically an experiment that the scientists undertook saying, okay, so we're at 1 degrees now. Let's say all emissions were shut down tomorrow. So, ignoring whether that's socio-economically possible, if it's physically possible, would the inertia in the climate tip us over 1.5 anyway? And I think the answer is no, it probably wouldn't, because you can see in most of this cloud and these lines here are below this 0.5 degree line. So, it's 1.5 degree line. So yeah, the race is still on for staying within a 1.5 degree warming limit. So then, if we do hit over 1.5 in some time, which could be as soon as 10 years from now, but not necessarily, there'll be an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control. I think she's getting that from this paper, which is very popular. It's written by especially this person, Professor Rockström from the Potsdam Institute on Climate Change, and this is the famous hothouse Earth paper, which looks at whether or not once you get beyond a certain level, global warming could become self-reinforcing and set off a permanent new warm climate on Earth, regardless of what humans do, because of positive feedback effects. So it's possible, and the paper demonstrates that it's possible, but it's theoretical. It's a possibility, and it's one paper. They say, well, where such a threshold might be is uncertain. It could be only decades ahead, a temperature rise of 2 degrees. So that's pretty scary stuff, and it's not impossible, but it's not the same as 10 years from now we will set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control. But I think that this is, where the science and the speechwriting interact. So this is a more standard IPCC way of displaying climate impacts. So you can see now we're at roughly 1 degree above global warming, and then there are the 2 temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, which is keep it below 2 degrees or below 1.5 degrees. And then, the popular way of showing them is you take a series of specific phenomena and you make these burning ember diagrams, so they get hotter and hotter as the temperature goes up. So, there's a lot of hardcore science behind each one of these bars. But at the same time, they're aggregating quite a lot of disparate information in order to kind of summarize the many different possible impacts of climate change in this way. But it's a difficult task. I mean, maybe you have some better suggestions of how to do it. When it comes to sea level rise, this is one of the ones that's more easy to visualize because, the sea is high and it could get higher and higher. And so this is from the more recent report. And so this is a low emission scenario, so I think roughly consistent with keeping climate change below 2 degrees. And this is a sea level rise that could be expected by 2100 and then 2300. And this is the high emission scenario. This is probably higher than business as usual. This is quite a high-end scenario. But nevertheless, you can see like a big difference between nearly 1 meter and more like half a meter by 2100 between these scenarios. And, gets really massive centuries out because it's a slow onset phenomenon. So to sum up so far, a lot of Greta Thunberg's speech is based on IPCC findings. So I think this is really positive. She's done a brilliant job of getting the science out there. There are, older people say a lot less careful things about climate change. However, things like irreversible chain reaction in 10 years' time are not IPCC findings. But what I think we can say from just the slides we've seen so far is that climate change impacts here already. They're going to get worse in all scenarios. They won't get as bad if we stop further warming. So the high-end scenarios are worse than the low-end scenarios. We're already at global warming of 1 degree, and limiting it to below 1.5 is physically possible. So now we look at science user number 2, and this is my new boss, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. For anyone who doesn't know, the European Commission is the kind of the civil service of the European Union. So it's the body full of thousands of professionals who work on EU policy before it's then presented to the political decision makers, who are the Parliament and the Council. So this is her speech to Davos earlier this year, the World Economic Forum. And she said, Europe will be the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050. So it's a big ambition, but it's a catchy slogan. But she's not just saying it because it's a catchy slogan. So back to the IPCC reports, and here we go, 3 paragraphs. You don't need to read them all, But the first one, it's quite clear that if you want to halt global warming, it doesn't matter whether it's at 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. If you want to stop it, you need to get CO2 emissions down to net zero. So that means there might be some positive emissions, but they need to be balanced out by some absorption from other sources. And going further than that, if you want to stop it at 1.5, then you need to get to net zero around 2050. And if you want to stop it at below 2, then you need to get to net zero around 2070. Okay, these paragraphs talk about CO2. There are other greenhouse gases as well that interact. I won't get into those details unless people want to talk about them later. So this is the same thing in pictures. So these are the 4 Ipcc pathways that they produced. These are 1.5 degree scenarios. So this is what you have to do to decarbonize, and these are different flavors of decarbonization. So this one is the one where the most behavior change happens. We do everything now. No one owns a private car anymore. There's lots of sharing, less meat consumption, a lot more forest growth, that kind of thing. And this is the opposite, where you rely on magic negative emission technologies in large quantities towards the end of the century. So anyway, to sum up what we got to there, the President of the Commission says that the EU needs to be climate neutral by 2050, and you can interpret that as either a statement of what the world has to do to reach a 1.5 degree target, therefore the EU has to do it too, or you can say it's to keep climate change below 2 degrees, it's the EU being ahead of the curve and showing others that it's possible to do it, because if Europe isn't going to lead on it, who else is? And there's a lot of discussion about how it can be good for society, rejuvenate the economy, and that it's technically possible, that it spurs new industries. There's some evidence of that in Europe at the moment with what's happened already. But this is a lot more ambitious than what we're doing now. And if the EU, and I suppose Norway, can't demonstrate this in reality, then who else is going to do it? So this is how we could get there. This is the European Commission analysis from 2018. So this is net zero emissions here, which means there's some emissions left from the sectors that are very hard to decarbonize. So what do we have here? Look at this: agriculture and transport, whereas power has to just go to zero quite quickly with renewable energy. And then, but it's still some emissions, and they need to be offset by a combination of forest growth, so that's land use change, and negative emission technologies. So that's things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, some technology where you sequester CO2 under the ground. So these are the 2 different flavors of net zero that came out of the Commission's technical analysis. It's available here, 500 pages. It's a good read. And this is these are the roughly 10 scenarios that the Commission looked at, because as you saw from the previous diagrams, there's no one right path to net zero. I mean, it's full of societal choices and research and development going on. So these are 80-degree scenarios, so minus 80% by 2050, and these are the the climate neutral scenarios, so net zero. And this one, 1.5 degree life. I mean, if you were to take together the best wishes of policymakers and NGOs and anyone advocating for a greener society, then this is the one you'd want to aim for, because there's lots of positive lifestyle change, and there's lots of forest growth, and there's not so much reliance on the negative emissions technologies. This is the alternative with more reliance on the negative emissions technologies. And so, that's the techno-economic path to net zero. So that was complemented December last year by the European Council endorsing the objective of achieving a climate neutral EU by 2050. So this is a big deal, because the European Council is all 27 heads of government, not just the most progressive member states, also some of the poorer and new member states. They all, collectively, they've all managed to decide that this is the objective. So it's not just a European Commission technocratic chart anymore, it's now a political objective. So it's a very high level objective. Obviously, how you get there is still all to play for. And so now we're just going to talk a bit about what's underneath these objectives. So the EU's current target is this one, to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. And the important thing about EU targets, maybe Norwegian targets too, I wouldn't know, is that it's not just a target and then you say something which sounds ambitious and hope for the best. It's underpinned by a very comprehensive layers of legislation and policies and measures and mutual promises that the countries make to each other to do their part. So there's a renewable energy target, there's an energy efficiency target, there are building standards, there's something about interconnecting the electricity grids so that renewable energy can be traded across the block. There's a standard to reduce emissions from cars, and there's what is this? Oh, and that's a mainstreaming of climate and funding. And there's also this thing, energy union governance, which is quite innovative. It's so this is because it's not for the European Union to tell every country how they produce their own energy, but nevertheless, if every country isn't doing it in a way which is consistent with their climate targets, then we're not going to meet the climate targets. So there's the energy union is like this kind of constant dialogue process where every country submits its plans for energy 10 years and then 50 years ahead, and the Commission looks at them and then reviews them and then they maybe resubmit them. So it's a kind of softer way of contributing towards this target here. So this is the current target, and it's had some success. I mean, this is the EU has been cutting its greenhouse gas emissions year on year for over 20 or 30 years. While the economy has continued to grow. So, it shows that decoupling of emissions and economic growth is certainly possible. Obviously, with the new ambition we have now, it's the easier steps are the earlier ones, and the harder steps are the ones that are in front of us. So, it's we'll have to keep this going. But I mean, I won't get into the details, but there is decent evidence that this is driven by the policies that have been undertaken. It's not arguments such as this is just because you buy everything that's made in China now and the emissions happen over there. It's not entirely true. There's decent evidence that this is policy driven, and this is the European Green Deal. So this is what Ursula von der Leyen was talking about when she said we're going to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It's basically if this is the status quo, this is the plans to upgrade it. So no more 40% reduction by 2030, now a 50 to 55% reduction. No more 80 to 95% reduction by 2050. The aim is to go for net zero. And this is now the political goal, as you saw from those European Council conclusions. But the equivalent of this, the comprehensive package of policies and measures which are greater than what we're doing now, this starts now. This is now is the time for action. So my colleagues back in Brussels are very busy working on proposals for some of these measures. So I just concentrate on two parts of it. So it's called European Green Deal. I mean, you've probably heard the phrase Green Deal used quite a lot, in the States, in other places, and it's not chosen at random. It's chosen because it's not just about the climate targets. It's also, especially this just transition is the key element. So it's about trying to make it socially fair, which is, of course, important in its own right, but also in the EU is the only way you're going to get an agreement in the first place when you've got Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, all in the same block, all signing up to one common target. It's not going to happen unless some kind of solidarity mechanisms are built in, and so obviously there's plans to release lots of EU funds to help make this happen as well. So that's partly funds to make sure no one is left behind, but it's also funds to invest in the new technologies that are needed. And also the Climate Pact. If you remember right back at the beginning, I put on these little arrows that said, the transition to net zero isn't going to happen in government ministries alone. And I think this has kind of been realized in the institutions as well. So it's not clear quite what form it's going to have, but this is a part of the Green New Deal will be to facilitate grassroots movements. So if you like, imagine the target is set in Brussels. Brussels says you have to meet a certain target. It's divided up between the member states. Okay, so now Germany says to the Germans, okay, well, we have to reach this target. Even then, it's the people of Germany and the businesses and the cities and the countryside which are actually going to take the action. It's not the government in Berlin. So there's always going to be the last mile of civil society action, which is going to be needed. So trying to do more to engage that is what this climate pact is about. And so, to finish off, I'm just going to talk a bit about the EU in the context of Norway and in the context of the international climate negotiations. So this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. This is where 200 countries get together collectively to agree on climate action. And this is Marianne Carlsen, a very good Norwegian negotiator at some kind of event. And I won't go into the same detail, but in a similar way to the EU targets, you can trace the path from the climate science to what's been agreed globally as the Paris Agreement goal. The goal is to keep the temperature rise well below 2 degrees C, or pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5, which is why I was going on about 2 versus 1.5 on those charts before. There are also goals on adaptation, resilience, and financial flows. So it's kind of similar to what I was saying about just transition in the EU. The world isn't going to sign up to this thing if it's only about making effort, and you have to get the developing and emerging countries on board as well. But it has been ratified by over 190 countries. Over 190 countries have submitted their so-called NDCs, so their national plans for cutting emission. This is where you get into the heavily negotiated details of the Paris Agreement in 2015. This business of countries setting their own targets. So, it would be great if like we do in the EU, the IPCC said how much was needed globally to stay within our temperature targets, and then politically the cake was cut into quantitative targets for every country, and off we go. But the Paris Agreement isn't like that. It just politically, wasn't possible. I mean, the flip side of that is that it covers the whole world. I mean, previously the Kyoto Protocol had targets cut up between countries, but it only covered developed countries, and a treaty like that, well, it just wouldn't solve the problem of global climate change nowadays. So we now have a global treaty, but a global treaty where everyone sets their own target. But they are obliged to set the most ambitious target they can, and they are obliged to track progress, which means they can't just set the target and then walk away. They have to, there's what's called MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification, so they have to report every 2 years on their progress towards the target. And then every 5 years, there's going to be what's called the Global Stocktake, which is where globally the countries get together and see whether the world is on track to meet the objectives. So it's kind of called the ratchet. With the theory is that that everyone knows that what needs to be done globally, even if there's not formally any naming and shaming, like you haven't done enough. And each of your NDCs is supposed to be more ambitious than the last, so the ambition goes up over time. So that's the beautiful Paris Agreement architecture. So far, it's only 5 years old. Most countries' commitments only enter into force next year, but the ambition isn't sufficient to reach these goals. So this is this is where you would get this conditional NDC scenario if every country met the targets that they'd submitted. So as you can see, it's lower emissions than current policies, but it also doesn't get you within the range of the reductions needed for the Paris Agreement goals, which are a lot higher. So raising ambition is definitely needed. And Norway has been one of the first countries to update its NDC. So every country should be doing it in 2020, because you can, the way it's written, you can have a 5-year target or a 10-year target. But either way, you have to submit what you're going to do every 5 years. So every 5 years, you could either submit a new one if you want a 5-year target, or if you've got a 10-year target, you just update it. And so everyone has to submit an update in 2020. And Norway was first off the mark. So here it is on the NDC registry, the website where all of these commitments are kept. And if you look at what it says Norway enhances its NDC emissions reduction by at least 50 and towards 55% compared to 2030. So that's above their current target, which is 40%. And then probably the most important part, Norway seeks to fulfill this enhanced ambition with cooperation with the EU. And this is because Norway's current climate policy is also fulfilled through cooperation with the EU. So there's a longer talk this afternoon where I'll go in excruciating detail through what all of these EU climate policy mechanisms are. But basically, half of emissions in the EU are governed through what's called the emission trading system, which is a cap and trade scheme covering inventory, so industry. And the other half is done through national effort sharing in each of the countries. And Norway and Iceland participate in both of these schemes. So each member state has to do its fair share, and Norway does its fair share too. And the emission trading scheme covers industry across the whole of the EU and Norway and Iceland. All of these targets at the moment are built so that you add them all together and they get to the 40% target of the EU for 2030. But as part of the Green Deal, the Commission will propose increasing that target to 50%, or at least maybe 55%. So the EU is in the process of thinking about how to go higher, and Norway is also in the process of thinking about how to go higher. But as far as the UN is concerned, Norway has made the first move because it said, right, we're going to go to 55, or well, to between 50 and 55. That's what we're going to do. We're ambitious, we're Norway. But, in the details, they're waiting for the EU before they can thrash out exactly how they're going to do this. But they have promised that in the event that the EU is not capable of getting our act together and increasing our ambition this year, then they'll do more on their own if necessary. So as the EU, we haven't submitted one of these yet because we're in the same situation as Norway. Like, we want to be more ambitious, but you can't just turn it on like that. It takes a while to get the to get the policies designed. But on the other hand, we want to send a clear signal to the outside world now, and we're still thinking about how to do it. And maybe because it's a smaller country, Norway did this thinking more quickly. But then, the details are still to follow. So to sum up, climate neutrality, zero emissions, it's not just a slogan. It comes from the science. There's good reason why high-level politicians are talking about it. And in the EU and in Norway as well, these targets aren't just slogans. They're underpinned by real policies which affect people and industries across the economy. And both the EU and Norway are thinking about how they can do more, because we need to do more. And also internationally, the Paris Agreement is also based upon the best available science in terms of its global goal. It has global reach, but the pledges don't add up to where we need to be. So how you, in places which are more diverse than the EU and Norway, end up basing concrete action on the climate science while also making it fair and politically palatable. I mean, that's the big challenge, which is in front of all of us, and I'm sure lots of hard work, maybe some work for some researchers in this institute, I don't know. So there we go, that's the talk, and I guess we can have some Q&A now until people have to go to work. Okay, thank you.
Just before the Q&A starts, I just wanted to say that, as Miles already alluded to, that there is another event today, and it's part of our 105 on European Union, and Miles will be speaking about these issues in greater detail, and that's between 12:15 and 14:00, and it's in the Psychology Building, Auditorium 129. So you're most welcome to attend. Thank you. I think that Miles managed those Q&A sessions.
Okay. What's the house system? Like, one at a time? Groups of three? Let's go for one at a time.
I'd like to pick up on this latest issue of Norway being first. I think you're right that it's easy for Norway since we're a small country and we are basically saying whatever you'll do, we'll be part of it. But you used the term there, and I wonder whether that has some specificity to it, which is everyone is going to do their fair share. Is that a specific... I mean, in Norwegian politics, it's quite important whether we are reducing our own emissions or whether we're just part of an emission trading system which is open-ended with respect to how much of our obligation is met abroad.
Okay. Yeah.
So is that fair share some specific tag, or is it something that everybody wants?
Okay. Well, I mean, within the EU, I mean the emissions trading system is EU wide, but it doesn't allow importing of credits from third countries. So from that point of view, there's an assurance that that it's managed quite strictly. It's 15 years old now, so a lot of the mistakes about how not to run an emissions trading scheme have been learned over time, and it's been reformed over time. But yeah, I mean, if it does mean that you can't be as sure about whether some of the emissions reduction is happening literally in Norway versus abroad or not. I mean, the way it's set up, it is roughly 50-50. So basically, 50% of reductions come from industry. So the power sector, basically anything which is a large installation which burns fuel, and also including aviation now. And because those are globalized industries, that target is set across the EU or across the EU and Norway. So that's one half. And then the other half is the national effort shares. So that's reductions in every other sector. And there, every country has a different target. And that's set on basically on the basis of GDP per capita. So the richest countries have to do more than the poorest countries, with some kind of adjustment for cost effectiveness as well, because if there wasn't a cost effectiveness adjustment, then the targets for Luxembourg would be huge, and then they wouldn't be able to meet them. So that's where in the EU internally the fair share part comes in. In terms of the reduction effort, there's also things about how funding is allocated. So for Norwegian politics, I mean, okay, if I'm trying to spin it positively, I'd say that it gives Norwegian industries a level playing field compared to the rest of the EU, but also not a free ride compared to the rest of the world. They're part of the target, and it also in terms of Norway doing what's fair, that's a calculation and then a negotiation in the other sectors. So what you do in sectors that aren't covered by the emissions trading scheme, so in transport and other parts of the economy.
Thank you for the interesting talk. My name is Erlend Knutsen from StormGeo. I have a question regarding US, if I got you right, you're from the UK and you're working within the EU. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I'm alluding to Brexit.
Okay, yeah.
The two questions. One is, what do you think will happen to the European Union's climate policy now that the UK is going out? And UK was a pusher for more towards more active climate policies. That means that it's shifting us towards basically the Eastern European countries, like you mentioned, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and so on. They have more power now. The other question then is, within the UK, how will this affect your British policies on climate action now that they're not part of the EU anymore soon?
Okay, yeah, that's good. Great questions. I mean, I don't know the answer to your first question about political balance, but it's in play right now, right? I mean, I presented the Green Deal, so that's certainly keeping the existing 40% target, trying to raise it to 50 to 55% climate neutrality by 2050. Various solidarity measures within that to make it politically palatable. This is Commission proposal, which means that the new, without UK, European Union will be debating it this year, like very soon. So I won't give you the answer because you'll see soon enough. And in terms of what it means for the UK, I think what I didn't mention here was part of the Green Deal proposal is the climate law, which will be enshrining into EU law a net zero objective by 2050. And this is a culturally like a direct Anglo-Saxon import. This is this is not part of the EU legislative procedure. Nevertheless, it's what the President of the Commission wants to do. I think just as a public signal that this is the politically agreed way to go. So everyone, governments and stakeholders just have to figure out how to get there. And so on that score, I think going back to the UK. I mean, the UK has the Rolls-Royce kind of climate law with budgets set by an arm's length non-political body telling you what you have to do every 5 years to get there. And I can't imagine them rowing back on that. But when it gets to the, I think I've said, the EU climate targets aren't just a target. The target is the top layer, and loads of measures underneath, add up to getting you there. So whether the UK is going to follow or even exceed European regulations from energy, transport, land use, product design, that's a bigger question, and one which is probably caught up in the EU exit negotiations.
Yep. By the way, thank you for your talk. I actually have a very I have a question regarding the economic and socioeconomic part of the policies that we are taking in the Europe. As we all know, the environment is a public good. So if the rest of the world is not accompanying us in these decisions, in these policies that we are making, I mean, for example, the States and China, which are the producers of the biggest proportion of the CO2 around the world, if they are not accompanying us, how much these difficulties and these policies that is enforced on the European citizens then will avoid this global warming not to happen, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because there are plenty of uncertainties around any policies that we want to take or we are taking basically, but is this really going to help us? I'm sorry if it's a very radical question, but is regarding the risk analysis and uncertainty quantification of the any policy that we are going to take, is it really rational to continue taking these policies without accompanying the rest of the world? Or could you make a comment on that, please?
Oh, there are so many different answers to that question. I'm not sure any of them add up to the one definitive answer, but okay, well, let's start. So, well, at the moment, EU citizens want this action. As I think election results tend to show. I mean, it's debatable, but the new Commission President has given us a very clear test by setting out this Green New Deal proposal as like one great initiative right at the start of her commission. So, so the citizens want it or not, including when you get down into the details of what you have to do to make it happen. We'll see. I mean, is it a wise course? I mean, just looking at who has set themselves, tough targets and policies and who hasn't, it's clear that the EU strategy up to now has been one of attempting to lead by example. And you've seen from the graph, there's a pretty good story to tell, right? I mean, the economy has kept growing, and there's no clear evidence that underperformance in the EU economy has anything to do with climate policy. There are also arguments about investing in future technologies and not ending up with stranded assets, especially when renewable energy prices come down and coal plants are less economical. So there's the economic argument there. But you're right. I mean, that's not all that the EU does. The EU is very active in climate diplomacy. I mean, that's my half-time job. The other half being science. It's the EU is a big player in trying to get other countries to do better climate policy. And part of that is selling the EU example abroad. We had the first big emission trading scheme. We showed you how not to do it in the first 2 years, but now how it looks better in the next 10 years. So that's part of it. But still, this Green New Deal for the first time has suggested a carbon border tax. So it's quite explicit now, and the EU will lead by example, and if that doesn't work, taxing imports from countries which don't have good climate action is not off the table. I mean, there's no Commission proposal on that yet, so there's no small print for you to read about how it would actually work, but it could be around the corner. And then, yes, can the EU solve global warming by itself? I mean, definitely not, because we're 9% of global emissions at the moment. So if global emissions stayed at 90% of their current level, yeah, that's not going to get us to where we need to be for the climate goals.
Thanks a lot. Esmeralda Colombo from the law faculty. So I was wondering about two things. First, how the border carbon tax you were mentioning now is gonna work, considering the WTO and the possibility to be brought to proceedings before the different instances, the appellate body of the WTO, so that we can make it work also with existing trade cooperation, and whether you have an idea about how it can actually work, notwithstanding free trade and that imperative. And secondly, climate finance. I noted it's a very high ambition in the European Green Deal, and it can be also cost-effective, right, to bring about that decoupling of economic growth from environmental degradation abroad in developing countries that are setting up their electricity networks, pension schemes, whatever. But is there any focus that Europe has found already, has kind of detected for the future? I don't know, in Africa, Asia? Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we'll start with the border carbon adjustment. Okay, so I mean the Green Deal communication, yeah, promises that if it's introduced, it will be in line with WTO rules. I mean, yeah, you know better than I do that's very easy to say that, but then you have to figure out how to actually do it. I mean, I'm no trade expert, but I gather there are certain environmental grounds which could be invoked. You can try and invoke them, and then you see if everyone else agrees with you. I forgot to mention also, apart from the carbon border adjustment, at the moment in the emissions trading scheme, there's special consideration for industries at risk from international trade. So basically, it's a rule of the emissions trading system that that over half of the allowances have to be auctioned, and indeed the money has to be spent on climate action. And auctioning is supposed to be the default way of allocating allowances, but nevertheless, some of them are given away for free to industry. So that's industries judged to be at risk of vulnerable to international competition, or a risk of what's called carbon leakage, which means the emissions still occur anyway. They just didn't occur in the EU because of EU policies. So to address that, there's these free allowances. So part of the border carbon adjustment might be that that replaces the free allowances. So you've got the free allowances because of uneven climate action around the world, and that will be replaced by the border carbon adjustment around the world. But yeah, legally how it's going to work at WTO, I mean, we're not there yet. I mean, we're not even, it's not even clear, whether we're actually going to have a firm proposal at this point. But it's part of the communication, so it's on the table. And then climate finance, I think, within the EU and also abroad, I mean, it's a highly political issue, by which I mean, there's money at stake, and an important part of the conversation is what's called, greening the financial flows, or I think in climate finance jargon it's called alignment. So aligning financial flows to the climate goals, and that can be public finance, it can be private finance. The best example is the European Investment Bank's decision last year to stop financing fossil fuel projects. I think as of early 2020s. So we'll have to see if other important investors can follow suit. That's the qualitative side. And then there's the quantitative side, which is just, how much money, however much is on offer for climate finance, we want more, the recipients would say. So it's a challenge for ministries of finance to be persuaded to reluctantly give over taxpayers' money in order to finance decarbonisation in other countries. But it's also a job for environment ministries to say, whoa, it's not just about giving away the money, it's what you do with it. And even these two, if you've got a week of negotiations and you're discussing how to allocate the time, even agreeing how much time to allocate to the first half and the second half is a highly political discussion. So there's certainly goodwill in the EU, especially to do both of those things, but it's it is political, and also mainstreaming is very important. So trying to figure out ways where you're not just setting aside a chunk of money for climate, you're trying to use the much larger sums of money that you have for industry and for development cooperation and for whatever it might be in a greener way. And that's also easier said than done, but a lot of effort is put into it.
Yes, sorry. Hi. Thank you for an interesting talk. My name is Salla Turunen and I work upstairs. I'm thinking about norms, especially in political science and international relations. There's quite lots about research and talk about norms among the states. And for example, Anne E. Towns talks about this kind of dynamic rivalry between states, would the issue be in gender equality, development cooperation, or humanitarian action, for example. So would you say that climate action would be one of these kind of issues where states compete with one another? And is this rivalry working in the benefit or against of climate change?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'm not sure how I can answer it in a way which is in keeping with the literature that you cited. But what your question reminds me of is those hexagons that I showed, showing the policies underlying the EU climate target. Because, like I said, over 100 countries have NDCs. So over 100 countries have some paragraphs and maybe some graphs, maybe even some numbers to demonstrate how they're doing something ambitious and more ambitious than what they'd be doing otherwise. A much smaller number of countries are actually doing it in a way which is clear and transparent and verifiable. So in terms of countries competing with each other, I suppose, for each other's attention or for the attention of stakeholders, like I said, climate neutrality is not just a slogan. Okay, so the slogan is the bit which 90% of people will hear. So, the target was 40%, it's 50%. People won't hear whether or not you've tightened the pollution control legislation that underpins it, or they won't hear whether or not, okay, you changed the base year when you changed the percentage. So 40% compared to 1990 became like 45% compared to 2000, and actually it's not so easy to tell which one is the higher of those. So so in terms of I don't know, do states use climate as they might use other issues as part of rivalry? It's difficult to say, but I think for EU, the main thing for us internationally and especially internally is that the ambition is accompanied by the action and the verification of the action, which is the next level down. And then in terms of I don't know, there are international conventions and regimes on so many issues. So many issues related to climate, because there's the UNFCCC, there's the Convention on Biodiversity, there's the Sustainable Development Goals, and then beyond climate, there's even if you know how international relations works, if you sit down and look at how many conventions there are, there's probably more than you think. So in international rivalry in an organized way of kind of one-upmanship, greater ambition than your neighbor. I don't know. I suppose people working for states and the EU are the kind of unconscious actors pursuing this rather than literally, I don't know, looking at what the neighbor is doing and trying to go one higher.
there's lots of hoopla now about sustainability in finance. And EU is putting some effort into, I think it's called taxonomy and standards, labels, and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about whether you think this is much for show, or whether there is, what's going to make this forceful, if anything, and if that's what's happening, or whether, well, we'll see. Presently, it's mostly window dressing.
Well, I mean, it's kind of the same answer I gave to the previous question. I mean, if it's done badly, it could be, you know, there's always a risk that an exercise like that is just window dressing. But, you know, this is the EU, comprehensive layers and layers of technocracy are at work to try and make sure that it's not just window dressing. And then another factor is, I think in the finance community, they, there's the taxonomy work. In what I've read, because I don't work on climate finance myself, there's a lot of talk about what's called transition risk. So, which is, you know, an oil company suddenly finds itself in a world where no one wants oil because everyone's decarbonized. And there's also, I can't remember the risk of climate impacts themselves on the business. I can't remember what the term for that is. So that's kind of what the climate, what the finance community that's interested in climate change tends to talk about, and also things like green bonds. And what's there's also kind of attempts to get a dialogue going between the scientists, the modelers, so the people that make the kind of trajectories, like this is what you need to happen to get down to zero, that I've been talking about, and the finance community. So they've kind of, you know, they've just been leading completely separate lives for decades, and they're starting to move closer together just in terms of dialogue. But it's tough, you know. It's not obvious how you can translate, you know, a national and a global pathway into what a company should do. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, it is similar to my answer to the previous question. In the end, I mean, you know, after ambition, it's all what's called MRV, you know, monitoring, measuring, verification, also called transparency. That applies to national targets. It applies to subnational targets, to corporate targets. I mean, some of it's, you know, EU regulations, so especially obviously for countries reporting their emissions. Some of it is voluntary standards. But I mean, yeah, the battle to make sure that these things are meaningful and avoid greenwashing is, you know, alive on all fronts. Yeah.
But if there is a sledgehammer somewhere here, where is it?
A sledgehammer.
Something that you give us an example of what's going to make this forceful. What could make it forceful?
Some sort of sanction mechanism,
Well,
Banking regulation, for instance?
well, I mean, there's no one single measure. That's why it's so hard. But I mean, there's a ratchet of things like renewable standards, CO2 in cars standards. I mean, you know, energy came first, transport is coming behind. I mean, it's largely a question of trying to expand it to different sectors, which means it's not one piece of regulation; it's many. I mean, you know, agriculture and industry have to come next. But yeah, I'm not sure there's one sledgehammer. I mean, it's clear that you know, negative emissions technologies will be needed, which means that they need to work not just in the lab but also in the I suppose subsidized industries that have to deploy them. Yeah, I mean, the national emission ceilings are economy-wide and they are absolute, which means, you know, the emissions are legally required to go down, which means you will, if the breakthroughs don't keep pace with the targets, then there will be, you know, pinch points arrived at sooner rather than later. But yeah, I don't think there's one silver bullet of where it's I don't know, one thing which would constrain action which otherwise wouldn't be constrained. I mean, yeah, finance is a good example. I mean, you know, it's in terms of, you know, if you want EIB money, you have to get out of fossil fuels now. That's important. But yeah, it would have. That's the EIB, and that's a European institution, owned by the same member states that are setting these targets. And even then, that was tough to negotiate. So if you could get the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank to do the same, that's really moving the dial. So, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Maria. I'm from the Institute of Geoscience, and I'm wondering about how do you talk about the uncertainties in future climate projections, because we talk a lot about that the climate system is, yes, we know somewhat, but really it's moving changes are occurring in a speed that is unprecedented. And I'm wondering, there is non-linearity in the systems, and not a lot of complications on doing projections for things that have not been seen. So I was wondering, how do you in the EU talk about the uncertainties in the projections? Do you try to look to go where the mean is, or do you try to stay under like a more how do you say, better safe than sorry on uncertainties? And secondly, I was wondering about the measures. We saw some columns on strategies forward. How much do you plan to incorporate carbon storage mechanisms?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, those are great questions. I mean, I think the answer to your question on uncertainty, I mean, you basically see it in what I presented and what I didn't present. So, for example, I mean, I know NGOs like to talk a lot about the carbon budget as if it was a bank account, that we're about to exhaust, and we're exhausting at a certain rate per year. And I think in the way you asked the question that there's too much uncertainty inherent in the climate system to really set policy on that basis. That's one reason for not doing it, and the other reason is, well, if it's at zero, what does that mean? You just go home and don't try climate action anymore, which is clearly the incorrect response. I mean, every 1/10 of a degree is important. So that's why we plan the trajectories, because it means that that's what you do to start now. And it's also why net zero has been very powerful, because I mean, first of all, it's an intuitive finding, right? I mean, you need to stop the buildup of CO2 to stop the temperature rise. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. I'm sure you could tell me, but it's fundamentally true. And before the Commission made its current net zero strategy in 2018, the discourse was about safe levels of emissions and about where you need to go by 2050, because 2050 seems quite a long way away now, but it seemed even further away in those days. So it was like, should it be 80% in 2050, 85, 95? And so the change from discussing zero as where the EU needs to go and where everyone needs to go, was quite a break from that point of view. So then, in terms of dealing with uncertainty, I mean, when it comes to mitigation pathways, I mean, it's we always check that the EU pathways seem to be in line with what you need for well below 2 degrees and 1.5, but it's not a very precise navigation in that way. It's not like it's automatic that we'd adjust it up or down depending on what the latest refinement of the climate modelling, the CMIP6 says. But then, of course, for adaptation, you have to take a different view, right? You should look at that, because it's more of a risk analysis exercise. So there's the I'm sure there's what's called the RCP 8.5 scenario, which has recently been discredited as a current policy's emissions trajectory, which is a bit unfair because it was never trying to be a current policy emissions trajectory. Nevertheless, when you're looking at impacts, because there's so much uncertainty, that's where the more kind of probabilistic exercise comes in. But yeah, I mean, there's no getting around it. I mean, you've seen from what I've presented, it's science-based, but it's also, making simple messages out of something which is inherently complicated.
Last question.
Just a couple of quick questions to things that you alluded to. So the first one was about the kind of import emissions, and if there was any way to calculate, how much the EU emits if you include polluting imports. And the second one was sort of if you look at that picture, for example, you see recycling, something to do with water, and things not necessarily directly related to CO2. I just wondered to what extent the kind of Green Deal has this kind of multifaceted goals attached to it that aren't just about CO2 reduction, and if there are any trade-offs there and anything that you have to think about. Yeah.
All right. Well, okay. So on imported emissions, I mean, under the inventory rules, so the UN inventory rules, it's emissions are measured on a territorial basis. So it's emissions occurring on your territory, and of course, emissions that products that you might import have emissions embodied in them, and people have attempted to measure consumption-based emissions. It's a fruitful source of academic endeavor if you want to go into it, but it's replacing. It would be setting policy on that would be replacing something which is closer to a measurement with something which is closer to a best guess. Like who's to say if there's I don't know, a plastics factory in China that uses PV emissions and PV to solar to power it, and one that's coal-based. Who's to say which one produced the product which came to the EU market? It opens up a whole counterfactual world, and more importantly, under the Paris Agreement, every country is responsible for its own emissions. So we don't use consumption-based emissions for that, and nevertheless, the best guesses at consumption-based emissions, which I have to stress, really, I mean, if you look at the supplementary material, you look at the modeling, it's not measurement, it's science, but it's science with lots of socioeconomic uncertainty and assumptions you have to make. So yeah, EU consumption-based emissions would seem to be higher than production-based emissions, and the reverse would be true for China. But also, they've both gone down over time. It's not like the territorial emissions have gone like that and the consumption-based have gone like that. It's more that, the consumption is higher, but they've both been going down. So then, and also the consumption-based don't take into account EU exports. So I don't know, wind turbines that are made in the EU using stricter pollution control than might be true in other countries. If they're then exported to another country, then that basically ends up decarbonizing the consumption-based emissions of the other country and making the EU look dirtier because it's not just adding on the emissions from the imports, it's subtracting the emissions from the exports. So if you try and adjust for that, then the EU looks better. But then that's even more into a kind of counterfactual exercise rather than a measurement. And then the Green Deal, it's explicitly trying to be more than decarbonization, trying to bring different strands of policy together. Biodiversity is the big one. It's it just seems people are constantly saying they're both important. There has to be synergies between them. They're both equally important politically, and it's true. But there's just a lot of detail in looking at what these synergies and trade-offs look like. Forest growth is the easiest example, right? If you plant a monoculture, it might soak up a lot of carbon quite quickly, but it's not very good for biodiversity, or how much biomass or energy is sustainable. Nature-based solutions, it's a great concept, but quantitatively, how much can they deliver towards the climate targets? My personal opinion is, these two agendas have to go together, and politicians have said that enough now, and now people at a sub-political level really need to figure out what we need to do to make it happen. But it's good that there are moves in this direction. I was at an Ipcc meeting before I came here, and one of the things they adopted was a joint meeting between Ipcc and Ipcc, which is basically biodiversity Ipcc, and they both produced quite high-profile reports recently on one was the global biodiversity assessment, and the other one was a special report on climate change on land, and the other one on climate change in oceans. And they're going to get together in London in June, and I hope they'll have a good look at their respective reports and figure out, what are the synergies, what are the areas where it looks like there are mixed messages, and properly get on the same hymn sheet in time for the biodiversity COP and the climate COP, which are happening this year